Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a nice weekend and you feel as relaxed as one can feel during these times. I thought I'd be a little slice of watermelon today because it was kind of a summery sort of theme. Looks like I'm in what is that, a swimming pool, maybe in Hawaii? Oh, that's nice. That brings back memories, huh? Anyway, um, it's our last week of class. Boy, these summer sessions go quickly. That's okay. We have a lot more to talk about, some of the most interesting stuff in the course as far as I'm concerned. But of course, I think everything is interesting. I'm a big old nerd. Before we get started today, though, we do have a final coming up, and I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about that and see if there's any questions about the final. Let's go ahead and put that information up. There we go. And I think I can stay a watermelon while I talk about this, don't you? Yeah, let's do that. We'll switch once we start teaching. So, here's the deal. I think, okay, so the finals are usually scheduled for the Friday and Saturday of the last week of classes for summer session. But I think as far as I can understand it, I can give you through Sunday again. Grades need to be turned in Tuesday morning. I want to make sure I have Monday to do the final grading. So that should give you some more time. The test will be posted 12 a.m. Friday morning, so midnight Thursday night, and you'll have until midnight Sunday night to take the exam. It's the same format as last time. It's 60 questions, 80 minutes to take the 60 questions, and it will just cover all the lecture material since we had our last exam, the midterm exam. That should be pretty clear. So that's going to cover touch and vision and multisensory perception, as well as all the discussion section relevant to that, including the rubber hand illusion discussion section, the Helen Keller video. If you haven't watched that, please do. Facial attractiveness and multisensory attractiveness, which I believe Serena covered yesterday, along with synesthesia. I think that should do it for the discussion sections and all the book material from chapter 6, and then do read the epilogue as well. So all the chapters up through the final chapter 11 and the epilogue. Same format as before. It must be open book. I mean, it must be taken alone, but it can be open book. And you now know that you all did so well on the midterm. I really don't need to explain this to you anymore, but you know you need to study for an open book test. Even if you are able to have access to all the materials in the course, you certainly won't have time to look up all questions. So again, what I recommend doing is going through the test, answering everything you can based on your solid studying, and then you should have some time to go back and look at the questions that you were a little unsure of, and that's a good time to look up the answers through the notes or the book or however else you want to do it. Tomorrow during discussion section, Serena is going to hold a review session again, and she'll be doing that little game show sort of format that you folks enjoyed last time. There'll be more questions this time, she said. But if you can quickly look through your notes tonight, it would be great, because then you can come in with questions to ask her tomorrow. Once the exam begins Thursday night, you won't be able to ask questions, so it'd be a good idea to be able to look through your notes and ask questions tomorrow during your discussion section, period. Okay, so no surprises, same type of format as last time. It shouldn't be too difficult for you. You all did so well on the last exam. I have total faith you'll do well on this exam. Let me see if there's anything else I can remember about the exam. Nothing offhand. So let's go ahead and just see if there are questions for the exam. I think I can now change myself back into a person. Yeah, oops, you're not supposed to see that. That's the green screen. Let's instead show you this very exciting, something's not working right. There we go. I wanted you to see that. Okay, yeah, people like this one from last quarter. If these get too busy, let me know. I think this is a fun one, though. So here, we're on a roller coaster. We're about to go over the top. Here we go. Here we go. Is that exciting? Okay. Are there any questions that I can answer? Let me see if there's any questions. Stop sharing. Questions that you folks might have on the exam, anything like that. Nothing? Okay. Again, I recommend that you come into your discussion section tomorrow ready for some reviews. So you do ask some questions. You know, there are some more complicated things, you know, like the idea of neuroplasticity. And then later on, we will be talking about mirror neurons, which are a little bit complicated. So you might want to ask about those tomorrow. Okay, if there's no questions then we will get started on the material. Oh, yeah. There is one more thing I wanted to mention to you. Hold on. There is one more thing I wanted to mention to you. And that is, if you have time, if you don't mind, if you could go to the iEval, you know, where you're supposed to evaluate the course and stuff, that would help me. As I go downhill, that would help me because I have to teach this course again in the fall, but in the fall it's going to be taught to, again, 250 people. And if you have any recommendations on how to improve the course, you know, of course, we're all new to doing this online. If you have any recommendations, just let me know through the iEval, and it would be really helpful. So please, if you do get a chance, go to iEval and you know, review the course and all that stuff. And then if you have ideas on how the course can be improved, that would be great. Okay. Let me pull this down a tiny bit. Good. I think we look good. All right, so let's share this screen now with everybody. And yes, where we left off was talking about faces, and I love faces. I think they are really interesting because they do provide so much information. And we talked about the ways in which facial information can be conveyed so quickly. It's as if your brain, you know, has a specialized mechanism just to recognize faces and all the information that faces can actually provide. And you know, we talked about that nothing communicates so effectively as a human face. It communicates, of course, the identity of a person, but it also communicates their gender, their intent, and that's where we are here talking about expression. When you recognize somebody's expression and what their emotional state is, you are understanding something about what their intent towards you might be, even if it is, you know, to do something, to be something friendly towards you. You still are understanding something about intent. And then, of course, in talking about attractiveness, we're talking about things related to, you know, the potential reproductive success. And then we'll, of course, be talking about the language that one can extract from faces in probably not today, probably on Thursday. But we talked about this fact that faces are so important to our perceptual skills that we're able to process faces even without our consciousness being part of the function. So there's a lot of information we can get about faces without even knowing we're looking at faces. And we discussed this in the context of recognizing people like Mick Jagger and Saddam Hussein, and then categorizing them as famous or not famous based on that. All that's done, that can be done unconsciously. In fact, that has to be done unconsciously. And then we talked a little bit about the fact that we can recognize facial expressions also without having conscious access to the faces themselves. And we talked about subliminally perceived faces can do things like have unconscious influences over things like aesthetic judgments and judgments of or decisions that we make under hypothetical scenarios, like walking down a dark street. And then also the fact that you can actually have very subtle but measurable effects on a person's mood for a very short time. And I want to be very careful how I talk about this because these are very subtle effects. It's not like you can, you know, spend your morning looking at happy faces and kind of put yourself in a good mood for the rest of the day. It doesn't really work like this. It can have subtle effects, and the subtle effects can be temporary. But yes, if you are looking at a happy face, you know, the smile can put you in a little bit of a better mood subtly and just for a brief period of time, but it can be something that's replicated. So it is, it is there. But what I wanted to talk about next was something I think that is especially interesting about facial expression, and will actually be important for our chapter after we're finished with faces, and that has to do with imitation. So we're going to be talking a lot in a little bit about inadvertent imitation. And what I mean by inadvertent imitation, it's the imitation we do of another person without being aware of it. So it's unconscious imitation, inadvertent imitation. And one of the things we know about that is it happens with expression. So when we see a smile, when we see a frown, we do some subtle and unconscious imitating of that expression. Let me give you the example of a smile. What you're seeing here on the right, this person here, is kind of the bottom half of a face of a person looking at a computer screen and making judgments of faces, say how old they are, or gender, or something that's really irrelevant to what we're interested in, just so to get them kind of looking at other aspects of the faces. And there's a camera on the computer, as we all have, that's actually taking recordings of the bottom half of the person's face as they're looking at faces on the screen. And whenever the faces come up that are smiling, what you see is subtle but systematic changes in the person's face looking at the screen. Okay, so here she is looking at a neutral face on the screen and maybe pushing a button to judge their rough age. Maybe they're in their 60s. She pushes a button indicating they're in their 60s or 30s or whatever. But really, that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in is what her face is kind of reflexively doing. And what you find is if she looks at somebody with a smiling face, she will do a subtle, but in this case, at least viewable facial smile herself. And the same thing happens when somebody is looking at a picture of a person frowning. Again, maybe the same task. Their job is to push a button, whether the person's in their 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. But what we're interested again in is whether they're going to do subtle, kind of unconscious imitation of the expressions they see on the screen. And here you see what would happen if a person is looking at a frowning face. Often this is measured more in what happens on the top half of the face, which is kind of the brow lowering. Okay, you can see I'm doing that now, as they're looking at a frowning face. So there will be subtle imitations of a frowning face as well. Now, in this demonstration I have for you, you're actually able to see these changes. But in a lot of these experiments that look at this unconscious imitation of expressions, you actually can't necessarily see by eye those imitations. But even without that, what you can do is measure the muscle movements of the face as they are looking at another face, so the muscle activity. And what these experiments involve, you don't need to know the technical detail, but what they would do is put little sensors across the face, and there'd be some sort of cover story. Say, okay, we're going to be measuring. This is for measuring your face later on, but we're going to set this up now. But first, we're going to have you look at look at people of different ages. Your job is to look at the age of the person, look at the pictures, and then push a button about the age. But they'll be measuring actually the muscle activity under the skin as people do that. And this is just another way of kind of recording that there are reflexive, imitative muscular changes when a person is looking at an expression. And it's imitative in that if a person is looking at a smile, even if they don't then kind of create a visible smile themselves, their smile-related muscles will be active. If they're instead looking at a frown, their frowny-related muscles will be active. So there's two ways of doing this. You can do it visibly sometimes. People will show a little visible imitative smile. Or if they're not, you can do it through recording muscle activity. okay, which is another valid way of determining if people are reflexively doing this. Now, it's interesting, people at the end of these experiments will be asked, okay, did you find the task hard, categorizing people into, young, old, that sort of thing? I say, I do okay. You say, okay, did you notice that while you were looking at the faces that you were doing some subtle imitation of the expressions of the faces? And people will say, no, I was just doing this, trying to get through it, doing it as quickly as I could so I can leave the lab. But no, I didn't notice anything like that at all. And in fact, they'll then be shown the images and say, oh yeah, look at that. I actually did smile. And if they, you can't see these, they could show the muscle recordings, and it happens pretty systematically, which is really interesting. So, you've probably heard this old adage that if you smile, a smile is contagious, right? A smile, you smile at somebody, they'll smile back. And yeah, it's the polite thing to do, right? Something I think, at least I miss now that we're wearing masks, is to be able to smile at people that, in the store, especially since, everyone's going through such a hard time. I want to kind of express empathy through smiles, but I can't. That's why I need this thing. I haven't actually worn it out yet, but maybe I should, just so I can convey smiles. How do I look at this? Yeah, like that. Yeah, so that happens, and we're polite, we smile back and all that sort of thing. But even if we don't know we're smiling back, we are unconsciously smiling back by activating the muscles that are associated with our own smiles. And the same thing does happen with frowns. There's kind of an empathetic, reflexive imitation that our faces do, which I think is interesting. It's almost as if our faces are kind of subtly coordinating with each other, kind of almost dancing with each other. So they kind of coordinate in subtle ways, which I just think is just so interesting. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, well, that's kind of cool. I'm maybe not surprised because I've experienced this consciously. So yeah, maybe this can happen unconsciously. But what you're thinking is, is this one of these things again, where if you don't know you're seeing a face, that it can affect you? In other words, if the faces are shown to you subliminally, do you show this kind of reflexive imitation, the subtle, unconscious reflexive imitation? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If the faces are shown to you too quickly for you to even see there's a face on the screen, you still will show a kind of subtle, reflexive imitation of that smiling face that you don't even consciously have an experience, are aware of. So it'd be like that sort of experiment we talked about before, where people are asked to rate, the conscious task is to rate the aesthetics of a figure. Is this a nice Chinese character? Is it a less nice Chinese character? Something like that. And they do that. And they might notice that right before they see that there's a flash on the screen, but they aren't aware of what that flash is. At the very most, they'll see a flash. So a lot of people don't even see that. No one reports seeing a face. But if the face is smiling, okay, it will have subtle influences on one's own face, the subject's face, as they're being presented that at a subconscious level. So again, just think about this, that faces are so important to our brains that they come in and they can affect us subconsciously without even us knowing that we're looking at a face, to the point that they can induce a reflexive sort of expression in ourselves. So smiles are contagious, as are frowns, but smiles are contagious even if they're unseen smiles, and even if we're unaware that the contagious aspect of it is affecting our own face. That's how quickly, efficiently, effectively our brains process faces. It's really cool, isn't it? Don't you think that's cool? Finally, there's some subtle evidence, okay, that when we see a smiling face and we ourselves go through that smile reflex, it can have a subtle influence on our emotion. Now, I'm a little hesitant here because this is, I haven't looked, back when I wrote the book, the evidence was fairly strong. There was a lot out, but I know since then there's been people that have questioned whether it really has any sort of measurable effect on our emotion. But let me tell you about the experiment nonetheless. What happens is people, again, would be looking at these subliminal faces, unaware that they're looking at smiles, and they will be doing this kind of reflexive, imitative, again, subliminal sort of smiles themselves. But if their smiles are in some way inhibited, and there's various ways of doing that. One of the easiest is you just have them, here, I'll put this in my, have them bite on something like this, okay? Or actually, maybe if you want to inhibit a smile, you have them put something like this. Can you guys see what this is? Yeah, it's just that little plastic thing I was using last week. Put it in their mouth like this. So they're doing the experiment like that. And you know, you make up a cover story, like you're going to have them, you know, press buttons like this in order to see if, you know, people can coordinate or something. If they have that in their lips, okay, the emotion manipulation I had talked about before, remember I said that mood can be subtly affected by subliminal faces. That will disappear if people are prevented from doing the little imitative smiling they do when they see a smiling face. So seeing a smiling face can elevate your mood just a tiny bit for a short time, but if you're prevented from doing the reflexive sort of smile yourself by asking people to put this whatever this is, little plastic piece, in my mouth, they can't reflexively smile, and they will show no change in their mood. There'll be no small elevation in their mood. So it seems that that reflexive smile that we do actually does have a change. It does have an effect on our reported mood, even if it's for just a little bit. Okay, cool. If you guys have questions on this, I know a lot of people find this really interesting. If you guys have questions, go ahead and type them out in the chat, and we'll get back to them when we take our next break. But hopefully you found that interesting. Okay, let's continue talking about faces, and I think you're going to find this next demonstration really interesting. What I'm going to be talking about here is personality from faces. So all through your life, you've been taught, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't infer something from people's personality, about people's personalities from just looking at them, right? You know, you don't know very much about a person until, you know, you talk to them for a while and get to know their, you know, their emotional life and all that stuff. And I think that's absolutely true. It's not good just to look at somebody and say, oh, I know what type of person that is. That's you know, can be very dangerous, as we know, right? But when it comes to faces, it's something we do kind of reflexively. We can't help but do it, and we do it very quickly. So when you look at a face, like these two faces here, and I ask you which one do you think has had a happier life versus which ones had more struggles in their life, we can, you know, make guesses, and we make those guesses amazingly quickly. They're formed within a tenth of a second, and those are the ones that we'll kind of stick with until we get to know somebody, right? But the question is, how good are we at doing that? And I will say this, that when it comes at least to these older faces, you know, faces that kind of have changed through, you know, their lifetimes, that show the you know, the kind of experience the person had, we're not terrible at certain things, okay? So in this first experiment, right, young people, I believe, were shown these faces of older people, and they were asked you know, given these two faces, which one probably has more pleasure in their life, which one has less pleasure in their life, that sort of thing. It's kind of a weird thing to do, you know. I don't know if I'd be completely comfortable doing it, you know, as a test, but we can't help but form impressions. And what you find is that people will do this and show some consistency in it. So if I ask you which of these two people had a harder life, okay, is it this one or this one? I think a lot of us might say this one. And these people, by the way, these women were asked to just pose in neutral expressions. Okay, they were posed in neutral expressions. They're also posed in I think they were asked to smile and frown, and they were shown all, you know, the subjects were shown all these different pictures. And afterwards, they were given little personality questionnaires, about their lives, about the amount of stress they endure. They've endured, the amount of happiness, that sort of thing. How would you rate your emotion on a 1 to 10 scale? And what you found is people weren't terrible with it. The subjects were not terrible at making guesses about which one had a happier versus a more struggling sort of experience in their life. Right? There was some correct consistency there. Some. I mean, it's very complicated, of course. But the question is, why would that be? Okay, why would that be? And I think there's different reasons why we might have some sense of, certainly we're not perfect, but why we might have some sense of a person's personality, maybe emotional experience, just by looking at their face. And when you look at these faces, I mean, there's they're not, there's a lot kept in there. Their hair is there. They're wearing some jewelry, of course, their clothes. There's a lot in there, but it looks like, there's a lot also in the expression of the face. How are we able to do that? And I think there's different possibilities, certainly. So one is the idea of this. Maybe you've known somebody like this, sadly, that they just, based on their genetics, they were born with a face that just doesn't look that happy when it's in a neutral, resting state. You may have heard the expression, resting bee face, right? It's kind of an unfortunate expression, but what it means is that, when you look at somebody or you look at a picture of somebody and they're kind of posing in their neutral expression, for some reason they look bitter or they look cranky or something like that. And some people are just born like that, it's just their genetics for whatever reason. And if they're like that as a young person, that's going to, in a sense, kind of induce feedback from people that is less positive. If you were born with a smiley face, the chances are that more people are going to interact with you in a positive way. If you're born with a less smiley face, a more kind of bitter-looking face, then people will interact with you in a different way. And based on that, if people are interacting with you in a smiley way versus a more bitter way, that's actually going to shape your personality through time to some degree, right? Again, you're a young kid and you have a face that just is more smiley, then people are going to come up to you more often. If you have a face that's just a little less smiley, that when it's at its resting state, it looks a little bit more cranky, then people are not going to come up to you as much. And that could kind of continue through a lifetime to some degree. That idea, to the degree that it happens, is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what that just means in this context, you might have heard that term in other contexts, but in this context, the idea is that your personality kind of grows into your face. If you have a face that at rest seems more bitter, more cranky, then you're going to be interacted with like that more often, and that could make you a more bitter and cranky person, right? Your personality kind of grows into the way your natural facial structure works. On the other hand, if you have a resting face that tends to be interpreted as more cheerful, then people might interact with you in a more cheerful way, and that's going to have an effect on your personality through your lifetime. And you're going to grow into grow with a personality that kind of matches your facial structure. That's one idea of how we might then be able to perceptually interpret personality from faces. When we look at a neutral face that looks a little more happy, we might say that person is happy, and in fact they might be, because of in fact they have a more smiley face. Okay. Self-fulfilling prophecy that we grow into our neutral facial expressions, kind of. But there's another idea, and I think the other idea probably is more important in this, and that's something called expressive habits. The idea is this. Your face and its musculature is something that gets exercised throughout your life. I mean, you don't think of faces like this, but your face, the appearance of your face is to some degree based on the exercise the muscles of your face get through your life. So if you are in fact having a life that involves a more kind of cheerful set of experiences, you do more smiling, you do more laughing, that's going to have a different kind of exercising effect on the muscles of your face than if you have a life that is more of a struggle, where you do less laughing, less smiling. Okay, that's going to kind of, if you're frowning a little bit more, if you're worried a little bit more, if you're smiling less, the muscles of your face are going to have a different exercise through your lifetime, right? It's just regular, it's muscles, right? You do curls with your arm, you're going to have a bigger muscle here. If you do tricep exercises like dips or whatever, you're going to have a bigger muscle here, right? The kind of structure of your arm is going to be dependent on its experience, in this case, literally exercising. But with faces, the same thing is true. That, if you do a lot of laughing in your life, you've had a fortunate life and you've done a lot of laughing, a lot of smiling, then in fact, you're going to have a facial structure that shows the result of the muscular activity throughout your life having smiled. If, on the other hand, you've had a life that's been more of a struggle, and you smile less and you laugh less and you frown and maybe your face goes through a worrying sort of expression more often, then you're going to have a different set of, quote, exercises as you've gone through your life, and your facial structure will look different according to that. So this idea of expressive habits is kind of like, what type of expressions has your face gone through for your life, and how has that changed the resting structure of your face? Again, think about muscles like this. Even when I'm not exercising, say, okay, so I'm not Rosenblum, I'm The Rock, right? He's got super big muscles. The structure of his arms, even when he's just resting, when he's waving, hey, I'm The Rock, but look at my muscles, right? Is showing his experience of exercise. Our faces do the same thing. Our faces, as they are just neutral, show the exercise they've been through. And if we do more expressions of smile and laugh and that sort of thing, it's going to have an effect on the muscles. Also, it's going to affect the skin, by the way. You probably know this, that you get a little bit more of wrinkles here, kind of laugh lines you've heard. These are called laugh lines. These are called worry lines, all that sort of stuff. And there's some truth to that. So when it comes to elderly faces, as I mentioned, subjects don't do too badly at judging things like the relative happiness of one face to another, one person to another. And they do so whether the person is expressing, like they're smiling or frowning, or if the face is just in a neutral state. These are examples you're looking here with the face is in the neutral state. And I might say in this judgment that this woman looks a little bit more worried. This person looks like they maybe had a little bit more of a struggle than this person. If I had to guess which one would have come out a little bit more happy in a personality test, I might judge this one as more happy. I mean, again, let me step back and be careful here, because it could be that this person is the warmest person in the world. Usually if I do this in class, I ask people which one had a happier life, right? And people generally say this one, and I make a joke, well, this one right here is my mom, okay? Because, the idea that I would have given her a tough life. But I think most people do say that. It could be absolutely wrong, though, because this person, might be a very warm person for whatever reason. She just doesn't smile. This one might be maybe seems like they smile, but could be a little bit more brittle, cold. I mean, I want to make sure that we're not, I don't want you to go out and say, okay, now it turns out I really know how to interpret people's personalities from faces. There's always going to be, some deviations. It's important to know, but we're talking over when people are asked to kind of judge many, many faces and using many, many subjects, you do find that there are these relationships between what they will judge a person's personality to be and what their real personality will be as well. And if you think that's weird, that's kind of surprising, let me tell you a little bit about this. What I'm going to do now is go through a series of pairs of photos of people, And I want you to maybe to just write down or in your computer or something like that the answer to these questions. Which one is more agreeable? Which of these two people would you say is more agreeable? The person on the left or the person on the right? So you can just write L or R, or just write it down or type it in LR. Is the person on the right more agreeable or the person on the left? And I know these are, kind of clearly they're similar types of faces, but if you had to guess, person on the left or person on the right is more agreeable. Okay. How about this person? Which is the more conscientious person? Person on the left or the person on the right? Who is more conscientious? Okay, this person on the left or this person on the right? Cool. Okay. Which of these two people is more extroverted? The person on the left, the person on the left or the person on the right? Who is more extroverted? Who would be more likely to come up to you at a party? The person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. And who's more neurotic? The person on the left or the person on the right? Who is more neurotic? Okay. Just do your best. Person on the left or person on the right. And the next one is part of this experiment. It's actually a second experiment, but just so you know. This is part of the original experiment. Who is more adventurous? Who would be more likely to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to go canoeing this weekend? Person on the left or the person on the right? Or adventurous, open to new experiences, that type of thing. And then finally, this next one is part of a different experiment I'll talk about in just a second. But who of these two people would be more likely to be open to having a casual fling, casual sex? The person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. All right. Well, let me tell you how these faces were made as we look at these faces now. And as you can tell, they are pretty similar. They really are very, very similar. And they are similar for an interesting reason. And maybe if you look carefully, you can tell that actually you're looking at composites of faces. These are not actually single individuals. Each of these faces is kind of a collection of faces that have been superimposed on each other. And the way that this was done is, I think this is a very clever experiment. Here's what you do. You bring in 100 women, 100 undergraduates, and you take their picture, in a very kind of standardized way, because the idea is you're going to want to be able to line up the facial images, in Photoshop or something like that. So they're taken so you'll be, the faces are all the same size and everything. Okay. And then after you take these kind of very standardized pictures of the 100 women, you then have them go through a questionnaire. And the questionnaire is designed to actually tap into each of these different questions I asked. So let's go back here. Let's find another one maybe. Yeah, I kind of like this one, extroverted. Yeah, I think this is nice. Let's go with this one. Okay, so there's questions on this little kind of personality questionnaire that asks them about their extroversion. I don't think it uses that word necessarily, but it says, are you likely to, be the first one to go up to introduce yourself at a party or something like that? You probably see these sort of questions. Or are you more, somebody who would wait for somebody else to come to you? These are questions about extroversion. And there's questions about all these different things, having to do with neuroticism and all that. And then what they do is after they get the questionnaires completed from these 100 women, this is clever, they take the 10 whose questionnaires indicate they are the most extroverted, and the 10 out of the 100 whose questionnaires indicate that they are the least extroverted, the introverted ones. And then they take those faces of the 10 women and superimpose them on each other. And there's kind of a kind of cool little part of Photoshop that allows you to do this. So essentially what you're seeing here, and I'm giving away, this here is a composite of the 10 most extroverted women of the entire group. This one on the right is a composite of the 10 most introverted women in the group. Okay, these are kind of averaged across the 10 most and the 10 least extroverted women. And then after establishing those, they show these images to naive subjects that kind of like yourselves who just came in and just didn't know how these images were created and didn't know there was actually a personality test involved in creating these images. And these naive subjects just said, okay, if I had to make a guess, I'd say the person on the left was maybe the more extroverted than the person on the right. In fact, for each of these, I'll give you the answer now. Okay, for each of these, where do we start here? I think agreeable, right? Yep. The person on the left was a composite image of the 10 most of that question. So this person is a composite image of the 10 most agreeable women of the 100. This is a composite image of the 10 least agreeable women in the of the 100. Okay, I don't know how many of you had left as your answer, but that in this case would have been the one that is predictive of their personality, left. And all of these are left. This is a composite image of the 10 women who are most conscientious based on the personality questionnaire. And this is of the 10 women who are the least conscientious based on their personality questionnaire. We've already been through extroversion. Here's neurotic. I would say, to me, I think this does look like a more neurotic person than this one. What do you think? Yeah, I do. I think so. And again, it's the same thing. They give them the questionnaire. And, do you worry a lot? Are you hesitant to do things because you're concerned about what might happen? And if people say, yeah, that's me, I'm neurotic, I worry, then you might be in the group of 10 from which this image was derived. And if you're more laid back, you're not neurotic, you might be in the group of 10 from which this image was derived. And that's also true with adventurous. Do you like trying new things? That sort of set of questions. There's at least, I think, 5 questions per personality thing. And then this is a follow-up experiment, but people were asked, do you have casual sex with individuals fairly frequently, or are you more hesitant? And I should say this was a long time ago. And it was done in, I believe, it was done in Scotland. So, there's, times change, morals change and all that sort of thing. But in fact, this person on the left was created of a composite of 10 people who said that they were more sexually active than the person who's depicted on the right, again, derived from the 10 images of the people who said they were less likely to participate in casual sex. Okay. And so basically, these are all younger faces, and they are homogenized in the fact that, now, unlike the women in these images up here, they're really kind of taking averages. So there's nothing specific about a hairstyle or about jewelry or about clothing, and all that stuff is taken away in order to create these averages. And what you find is, yes, for at least with women's faces, there is some consistency. People, both men and women, are able to judge women's faces and their personalities with some degree of accuracy. Okay. This, by the way, I don't know if you've ever learned about this in another class. It's called the Big Five personality measures, and you don't need to really worry too much about this. But if you're a personality psychologist, if you've taken a social psychology class, you might have learned about this. That's psychologists, if they want to understand something quickly about a person's personality, they will give them this test called the Big Five test. And they do pretty well in capturing people's personalities. And the Big Five personality traits are considered agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, openness to new experiences. So yeah, people are not, naive subjects are not bad at judging which of two faces in this context have these personality characteristics. And this is also true of sexual openness. Now, a couple of things, I got to be very careful here. It's not like that, people are like 80, 90% accurate like this, okay? It's like, they're 52, 53% accurate. So it is a little bit above chance, right? But it is statistically significant, even though they're just a tiny bit, whether it's kind of meaningful because it's such a, close score as another question. But at better than chance levels, statistically speaking, at better than chance levels, men and women can judge women's faces along these big 5 personality traits and sexual openness. Men's faces tend to be harder to judge for both male and female subjects. They tend to be harder. And I think there was one personality characteristic, I can't remember which one it was for the men, maybe it was extroversion, I can't remember. But beyond that, the men's faces were harder to judge. It was done the same way, where 100 men were given questionnaires, and then the 10 most neurotic and 10 least neurotic were separated and then made to create these composite, kind of these average photos. But it was much harder to judge the male faces in this way than it was the female faces this way. Also true of sexual openness. But again, it's cool that it can be done at all. Let's also acknowledge, though, that people aren't like stupendous at this and, like 90, 80, 90% or something like that. And also, you're using the 10 most neurotic and 10 least neurotic. What about all the 80 people that are in between here? It could be that they can't do that at all, right? But when you use the endpoints, you use the ones that are at the extremes, there seems to be something in their face that can be detected, at least at better than chance levels, which is interesting. That is interesting. Okay. Now, whether that has to do, these are not elderly people, but they are adults, young adults, that have, at least 18, 19, 20 years of expressive habits that could, in fact, play a role. It could be that, let's just look at this again, extroversion, that, an extroverted person is maybe just more likely to smile or to, I guess, maybe have a wider range of expressions for whatever reason. And that might have kind of an expressive habit influence on a person's facial structure when they are clearly in a neutral position here. And that's relative to a more introverted person that might not have the kind of habits of smiling and having a wider range of expressions. That's also going to influence a person's facial structure. Remember, faces are muscles, right, and that have exercise. And this might be how, in fact, we're able to do this to at least a small extent. Or it could be this other idea, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? A person's extroverted partly maybe because they came out with an extroverted looking face and they kind of grew into that face or something like that. I think expressive habits probably play a greater role in this sort of thing. Okay. One last thing I want to say, and I see there's some questions and I can't wait to see what they are because I know people are really interested in this. One last thing I wanted to talk about was if our faces can change through experience, do our faces change to kind of match our spouses? And you may have heard this before that, you look at two people who've been together for 50 years and you say, gosh, they've grown to look like each other. This is a great example. So, of course, in the wonderful days of the internet, you go online and you look up spouses that look like each other. You'll find tons of pictures. And there's lots of reasons spouses can look like each other. Certainly, if they come from the same ethnic group, the same part of the country, if they both get a lot of sun, all that sort of stuff. But the question is, do they kind of grow to look more like each other? We at least in the old days, we would tend to marry somebody who had some sort of facial or kind of similar appearance and maybe the ethnicity or something like that. That's, changing, of course, to some degree. But the question is more like, after we get married, do we grow to look more like them than we did when we were married? So these are experiments where, kind of older people come in with their wedding photos and then their pictures taken of them as older people in the lab, and then they're shown to naive subjects and say, okay, can you match the spouses, and are they easier to match when they're older than when they were first married? It's that sort of study. And the answer is yes, but it depends. And what it depends on is something very interesting. Because after they did this, after they took the people's wedding photos and took the people's photos of them in their present appearance as older people, they had them go through a questionnaire about their relationship. And it really kind of tapped into how much empathy existed in their relationship. And what was found is that the higher the amount of empathy that the couple said they had in their relationship, and it was asked, questions like, do you support your spouse when they're going through a tough time? Do you enjoy laughing with your spouse? Those sort of questions. The more empathy the couples showed towards each other, the more they converged in appearance, which I think makes sense, right? Because what they're doing at that point is, if they're kind of sharing their emotions, they're sharing their expressive habits, right? They're sharing the laughs together. They're sharing the smiles together. They're sharing the concerns over their children together. And in doing that together, they're kind of going through the same sort of kind of facial exercises that lay behind this idea of expressive habits. And that is going to have an effect on their face over time, especially with elderly faces, we believe. So that makes sense. That yes, spouses will grow to look more like each other over time, but what that depends on is that they have an empathetic relationship. Some couples don't have as much of an empathetic relationship, and they will not show that their faces look more like each other over time. Okay, makes some sense. Cool. All right, looking forward to seeing what your question's about. So let's do that first, and then we'll go through a practice test question, of course. Okay, feel free to ask more now. Oh, people are writing down left, left, left. Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Kimberly and Ralph and Aya. Everybody, a lot of people said the left one was the one that best typified that particular personality trait, and that is exactly how the stimuli were made. So yeah, left was the correct answer, at least for this in this experiment. If you didn't get left right, that's perfectly fine. If you thought the one on the right maybe more typified that personality characteristic, that's fine. Again, people are not perfect with this by any means. Just over the big data sets, you do find that people are not bad. Okay, Chase asks, I know this is kind of unrelated, but I've seen a lot of pictures of people who have dogs, pets, who look like them to fit their personality. Chase, that's a great question, and it was going to be something I was going to address in the very next slide. So I'm going to hold on to that, because boy, was I interested in that when I wrote the book, and I'll tell you what happened when I looked up that literature. But I want to see if there's other questions about personality and facial appearance. I know people sometimes find this really interesting, so I want to make sure that we answer any questions people have about this. As I'm talking, again, I do this a lot in the class. I talk about how amazing it is that we can do this. At the same time, I want to make sure that you understand that we can do this to a small extent. Whether we can improve this ability is unknown. I know sometimes there's discussion of training to look for micro expressions that might help you understand a person's personality, especially if they're potentially threatening, if they're a criminal or terrorist or something like that. I don't think there's clear evidence that can be done yet, but the fact that we can do it at all, I think, is really interesting. Okay, other questions about this? And I just spilled water all over my shirt. Okay, then let's do our polling question, our practice question. And if people come up with other questions, that's perfectly fine while we're doing this. All right. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. This is a question on unconscious face perception. I think you'll do fine on this. What can the brain determine, often unconsciously, from seeing a subliminally presented face that would be shown too fast or to be consciously noticed? What can the brain determine, often unconsciously, from seeing a subliminally presented face shown too fast to be consciously noticed? A, whether a famous person is liked or hated, Mick Jagger versus Saddam Hussein. B, facial expression. C, both A and B are correct. Or D, none of the above. You should have no problem doing this. I'll give you another 20 seconds or so. All right. Looks like most of you got this, not a problem. And if you didn't get it, that's also not a problem because you'll get it for the final. Okay, I'm going to end it here and go ahead and share the results. And the correct answer is, in fact, C. The answer is both A and B. And so most of you got this. Let's first talk about A. And remember, that's that cool experiment where people were shown faces too quickly to even be recognized as faces. And their job was to say whether a face was famous or unfamous, even though they usually didn't see any faces at all. So they feel like they're randomly pushing the button. I love experiments like this where people feel like they don't have no idea how to do something and they show that they can unconsciously do it. I don't know, famous, unfamous, not famous, famous, unfamous. And what it shows is that, in fact, people aren't necessarily good at saying famous and not famous. What they're good at is when it's a famous face, they will push famous for that famous face if, in fact, if the fame is based on something positive, like Mick Jagger and his music, versus not positive if they're infamous, meaning that the person is hated, like Saddam Hussein. What they will do is they will push not famous for that person, even though they are famous, but they are famous for something negative. And so they can categorize famous people based on the type of thing they're famous for, something positive or something negative. So A is correct, and so is B. We talked about how facial expression, seeing faces very, very quickly, can induce us to judge something like a Chinese character as more attractive or less attractive, or have an effect over hypothetical scenarios. And in all those cases, the faces are being shown too quickly for us to have any conscious awareness of even seeing a face. So both A and B are correct, and that in this case, the answer therefore would be C. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead. It looks like there's one more question here. Yes, Kimberly says, I see it all. So she's addressing Chase. Okay, here's the deal about this, pets. Do we look like our pets? Well, you met my pet, right? You met my pet, Max the dog. Do I look like him? Well, when he gets a haircut and he looks very bald, he looks exactly like me. I don't know. Do you look like your pet? Okay, so here's the deal. Let's go ahead and address this. I think you'll find it interesting. All right. There you go. Okay, that's just taken from a advertisement for dog food from a while ago. I can't see what type of dog food it is, but it's adorable, certainly. And we do see this sort of thing. I think we do have intuitions that people kind of look like their dogs in some way. As of 10 years ago, when I wrote the book, I can tell you this. What people can do is they can match a picture of a dog. Okay, so let me tell you how this went. The experimenters went to a dog park and they took pictures individually of the person walking the dog and the dog, okay? And the person, taking the dog to the dog park, the owner and the dog, and then showed pictures of the owner. And these were not, cropped in any way. These were like pictures of the person from, I think, here up, so you could see what they were wearing and you could see their hairstyle and all that. And people were asked to match the owner with the dog, okay? And they could do that at better than chance levels. That they could do. However, there was no sense, at least back then, that they were doing that matching based on the person looking like the dog. Okay, so after they did the matches, and they say, hey, you're pretty good at that. You're actually right for a number of these matches. Are you doing that because these people look like their pets? And subjects would say, no, it's just I think a person who looks like this would be more likely to have a golden retriever. A person who looks like this would be more likely to have a toy poodle. A person who looks like this would be more likely to have, I don't know, a Bichon. Okay, and so, and I think we have some kind of social psychology to the sorts of pets people have. But whether they actually look like their pets is still, at least as of 10 years ago, there was no evidence for that. In fact, people had tried to study it, and they said, okay, let's have people match their picture with pets based on similarity in appearance. And when they did that, they found that no, people weren't being matched to their own pets, they'd be matched to another person's pet. So I don't know, what type of dog do I look like? Maybe a little like, I don't know, maybe like, I look like this guy right here, right? And that's not the type of dog I have, right? That sort of thing. So, I haven't looked at this. I haven't had a time. I've been busy, but I'd be curious if one of you wants to look it up and see if there's new research. And this is, it's got to be real research, not just, somebody who's doing it for a magazine or something like that. It has to be done with good controls and all that. It could be that there's actually evidence out there, but as of 10 years ago, there wasn't. That doesn't mean that we can't be matched to a dog, our own dogs. But the fact that it doesn't seem to be based on the fact that we might look like them, at least not that I know of. So, good question. All right, let's continue then and talk about other aspects of faces. We're going to finish this soon. Okay, I'd like to talk just very quickly about, because we're really kind of, again, the big story is how sensitive we are to faces, how good we are with perceiving faces. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the development of face perception. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. It's, it's just kind of facts. First of all, it seems that we probably are born to be sensitive to facial images. So when shown something like, this is tested at 9 minutes old, shown something like this, an array of different images like this, we will, in fact, at 9 minutes old, even though our vision is really poor, we will stare longer at a facial image than other images. And this has been replicated a number of times. I think, these comparison images here may not be quite fair. This is a little bit more complicated, I think, in some ways. So it could be, how complicated the image is, how intricate the image is, but it's been tested in other ways. And I think the consensus is, yes, as early as this can be tested, we do seem to be especially attracted to facial versus non-facial images, okay, which is interesting. By the time we're a day and a half, okay, we start imitating expressions. Now, do I have this here? Oh yeah, okay. I don't think this is actually going to work. Yeah, okay. I can't find it because of this. This is just a little little clip that would show how facial imitation would work. But let me talk to you a little bit about what this looks like. If you've spent any time with a 2-day-old infant, they don't actually have very much control over their faces, right? They seem to kind of be, kind of randomly sticking out their tongues, maybe kind of opening their eyes, yawning a lot, that type of thing. Okay, so it's not like you're gonna, go in front of your little niece or nephew and make a big smile and they're gonna smile back in 2 days. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen for a few months, that kind of reciprocal smiling back and forth like that. But what you do find is that if an infant at that age is shown a smiling face, and it has to be pretty close up because their vision isn't good, they will show more smile-like expressions than not. Okay, so if they see this, their little faces, I'm going to do a baby face here, like they might show that a tiny bit more than if they were seeing something like a frowning face or a face that has pursed lips or something like that. So the imitation is very subtle, okay? It's not like a reciprocal smile or something like that. But it does, they do show more smile-like behaviors at that age, which is pretty amazing. We'll see that later on as we talk more about imitation, but it is pretty cool. What else? Well, at 1 to 3 months, they can be shown a picture of their parents and will recognize it. So they'll stare longer. This person, at this point, they're of course not able to tell you verbally what's going on, but they'll do things like suck on a pacifier faster if they see photographs of their parents versus strangers. Okay, so they are able to certainly recognize images of their parents' face by this time. It's likely certainly they're recognizing their parents through smell and the sound of the voice and lots of other things. But when it comes to actually being able to test straight facial imagery and whether babies can recognize it, yeah, from photographs they can do that at least by 3 months, certainly most likely 1 month. So overall, what we can say is that we do have a predisposition for faces, that as early as it can be tested, we seem to prefer facial images, we seem to be able to imitate faces, an expression, we are able to recognize our parents. And think about this, that this is what an infant's vision is like. I don't know if you can really tell, but this is what looking at a face, this is what it looks like when you're 1 week old. So the fact that an infant that's 9 minutes old or 36 hours old is seeing something like this and can still recognize it as having a facial-like structure to the point where it's going to favor that, maybe start sucking a pacifier faster or whatever, and can actually, kind of subtly recreate the expression, a smile or frown or something like that, when their vision is as bad as this, is really saying something. This is, I think, 1 month. How does this work? Maybe you can't. No, I'm sorry. It's 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, and then this is, of course, adult. It looks like this week. Okay, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months. I think that's what that says. But the fact that babies can, actually use facial information, even when their vision is that bad, really says something impressive about how the brain is really able to take whatever facial information it gets and do something with it. And so what we can say is faces clearly have a profound significance. You can understand why the brain might kind of be especially sensitive to faces, because it conveys so much information about a person. Of course, their identity, their age, their potential reproductive health, what their intent is towards them. So all this is coming online probably at a very early stage, much earlier than it would be for other images, other types of visual stimuli. Which leads to an interesting question, and something that's addressed in the book, and it's been kind of something that's been addressed in psychology, perceptual psychology, for a long time. Is there, in fact, something special about the way we perceive faces? Do we use a different part of our brain? Do we use special processes that we reserve just for faces? And it's been a question that's been asked about face perception for probably 30, 40 years. And let me tell you where that research is now. Okay, and first let me give you a little bit of background about some of the research that's been conducted to examine this issue of whether faces are perceived in a special way relative to non-faces. As you're looking at this image, probably by now you know who that is, right? But when you first saw it, it was difficult. It was more difficult. It's much easier to recognize who that is when you see it upright. And this is a very well-known effect called the facial inversion effect. It is so much easier to recognize faces when they are shown upright to us than when they are shown upside down. When faces are inverted, okay, they are disproportionately hard to recognize relative to when they're upright, which is interesting, okay? Because what it suggests is that maybe there's something in upright faces that allows us to recognize them more effectively. And what I mean by that, so if I didn't have a face of Hillary Clinton upside down, instead I had a picture of a dog upside down, or a house, or an airplane, something that wasn't a face, you'd be able to recognize what that was almost as easily if it were shown to you upright, as if it were upside down. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that inversion inhibits face recognition disproportionately. Inverting other types of images doesn't have that effect. Inverting other types of images doesn't seem to doesn't seem to inhibit face recognition to that degree that it seems to affect faces. Why is that the case? Well, one reason scientists think that's the case is because when we look at upright faces, we're actually doing kind of two simultaneous processes on that upright face. When we look at an upright face, and so now let's concentrate on Hillary's upright face, how do we recognize this as Hillary Clinton? We look at her mouth. She does have a characteristic smile. Her eyes are a certain way. Her hair is often a certain way. Her jaw relative to her neck may be a certain way. We look at the features one by one, okay? We do look at the features to recognize somebody. But that kind of thing can almost be done upside down. Yeah, the features are inverted, but the eyes are still the same color and that sort of thing. And the smile is still broad and stuff. The idea is that when we look at faces upright, we not only look at the features, we look at the features' positions relative to each other. We look at the configuration of the features. We look at how far Hillary's eyes are above her nose, how far her mouth is above her chin, okay, how far her eyes are apart. And so we can do that when the faces are upright, but not when the faces are upside down. And the idea is that we are so good at recognizing faces when they're upright because we can do these two types of analyses on the faces. We can do both a featural analysis, an analysis on the featural information, and a configural analysis on the configural information. And again, the idea here is that you're able to do this by looking at the individual features one by one. Okay, that's a featural analysis. That's an analysis on the featural information versus the configuration of the features. That's another kind of class of information. The eyes are so far above the nose is just so far above the mouth is just so far above the chin, that sort of thing. And maybe, all these things are down from the hairline or something like that. And now at that point, we're looking at the configural information. And being able to do both of those things simultaneously might be what allows faces to be recognized so quickly. So the fact that we're able to take in this subliminal face information, that the brain is so efficient, so effective at processing faces, might be because it is allowed, that facial mechanism is allowed to analyze the image using two different processes, two different sets of information, the featural information and the configural information, okay? In fact, okay, sorry, let me just get rid of this. When we see the face upside down, we no longer are able to do so. Okay, let me give you a question here. Let's see. Yeah, let's stop here and let me give you a question, and then we'll take our break, and we'll finish up with this discussion after our break. Okay, are any questions from you folks first on faces, configurations, that sort of thing? Development. All right, then let's go ahead and do a polling question. Just get this in your notes. That's important. Okay, here we go. The question has to do with faces and personality. And the question is, why might your face fit your personality? Okay, why might your face fit your personality? Why might a person's face fit their personality? A, self-fulfilling prophecy. B, expressive habits. C, both A and B. And D, none of the above. So let's go ahead and launch this and see how you do, and then we'll talk about it. Look at you go. Give you a few more seconds here. Okay. Okay, I gave you about 45 seconds. That should do it. Most of you got this right. Go ahead and take a picture if you want. The answer is C, both A and B. So self-fulfilling prophecy, let's just remind ourselves of what that is. That is a correct answer. That's one of the correct answers. Well, it's true. The correct answer is C. It's self-fulfilling prophecy is true, though, because the idea behind that is that if you were born with a certain type of face, you might be getting social feedback that's appropriate for that face, that is then going to have an effect on your personality. And essentially what that's going to do is allow you to grow into your resting face. So if you have a kind of resting, more happy face, then people might be more likely to approach you with a positive kind of interactive style. And that will kind of shape your personality to kind of grow into your face. If you have a resting face that's, maybe a little bit more bitter looking or something like that, then when people, they might interact with you a little bit less. And when they do interact with you, they might be a little bit more hesitant for whatever reason. And that could potentially have an effect on your personality as you grow up. So the idea behind a self-fulfilling prophecy is that your personality actually grows into your face to some degree. So that is true. But so is B. Expressive habits is true. And that's probably even more relevant, I think. And the idea is throughout your life, you're going to have more smiles and more laughter if your life has been a little bit easier. And therefore, that is going to have an effect over the structure of your face. If you've had a more stressful life, that is going to have a different effect over the structure of the face. And because faces are like muscles, as you're kind of going through these expressive habits, it's going to have different types of influences. So expressive habits is also going to be part of this, suggesting that the correct answer is both A and B. So go ahead, take a picture of that if you haven't. And let's see if there's any other questions here. Good. Boy. So last quarter, people love this roller coaster background. I get nauseous, but I'm older, so hopefully it wasn't too distracting for you. Okay, let's just break until we can break until 11:30. So I'll see you in a few minutes. All right, mateys. Hopefully, you had a nice few minutes. Able to refresh. Before we continue with faces, I wanted to see if there's any questions on anything. Anyone have any questions they wanted to ask? Anything come up about the exam or anything like that? Was I already a pirate for you folks? I can't remember. You know, I taught the course last quarter, and I did a whole bunch of silly things like this. And I can't remember if I was a pirate. I've been a pirate so much in my life. I can't remember if I was a pirate for you. No, Captain. Thank you, Ralph. All right. I'm glad that you get to see me as a pirate. All right. Then if there's no other questions, let's continue. We can switch this off. I like this background. I feel the spray in my face. It's nice. All right. So, yes, good. Let's continue talking about faces. And the idea here is that it could be that the efficiency of face processing that we've been seeing through our entire discussion of face perception, you know, being able to perceive faces subliminally and pick out so many of these subtleties on faces, as we were discussing in the very beginning, could be because we're actually doing two sets of parallel processes on faces that we might not do for other things. And so, again, one is a featural analysis where we're kind of going through faces and analyzing its features as we're looking at them. And then the brain at the same time is looking at the configuration between the features. And in doing so, it's allowing itself to maybe be twice as fast in some ways at gathering up the information for recognition and expression and all these sorts of things. The question then becomes whether this is truly specific to faces, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through and talk about multisensory perception and things like that. But for a long time, it was thought to be specific to faces. So experiments like having to do with inversion and other aspects of facial processing were done with images like dogs and as I said, houses and airplanes, anything that wasn't a face. And what you would find is, in fact, that the same types of configural and featural analyses didn't seem to be done with those images. Yes, a featural analysis might be done with dogs or houses or something, but the kind of dual processing of the featural information and configural information was thought to be something specific to faces. So that when you invert a face, it becomes disproportionately hard to perceive because inversion is going to especially affect the configural analysis. Our brains can no longer say when we see Hillary Clinton upside down that her nose is so far above the mouth and her eyes are so far above the nose because it's inverted now. That is something we can do with upright faces. So in a sense, we're kind of changing a little bit of what we've been saying about faces being perceived in a specific way, a special way. What we're saying is that upright faces are perceived potentially in a special way. Upright faces are perceived with potentially special processes. Once you invert an image, when you invert a face, it's like inverting any other object. It becomes harder to see, but you don't get that advantage that you had with faces. So that might be really what we're talking about here. Our brain is especially designed to perceive upright faces and potentially use these two parallel sorts of information processes to do so. Another fun example of this, I think, is something called the Margaret Thatcher effect. And don't know if you know who Margaret Thatcher is. There was a movie about her life 10 years ago called The Iron Lady, I believe, with Meryl Streep. And it's about Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of England back in the 80s, same time Reagan was president here. Very conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. You know, not universally loved by any means, but just so happened to be the Prime Minister when some scientists discovered an interesting face phenomenon. Which has now become to be known as the Margaret Thatcher effect. So the only reason it's called the Margaret Thatcher effect is this is the person whose face was fortunate to have been chosen for this effect that was discovered in the 80s when she was prime minister. but it's a very well-known effect to face researchers. You're seeing Margaret Thatcher's face here upside down. And if I asked you to determine any difference between these faces, you say, maybe I can see, maybe there's something going on there with the mouth or the eyes a little bit. You'd have to look around a little bit to see that there is a little bit of a difference between those two images. But it would take a little bit of an analysis. It would take a little bit of you having to, kind of go through the image bit by bit to see where those differences might lie. And let me now just take that exact set of images and re-invert it so it's upright. There you go. Look how obvious the distortions become, okay? Look how obvious this looks gruesome. I mean, this looks scary, right? As you're looking at this. It is just so clear that we are so much more sensitive to upright faces and any distortion that occurs in upright faces versus in inverted faces. And again, it might be because we're doing kind of this joint configural and featural analysis that we are really reserving just for upright faces. Now, there's tons of examples of this, by the way. I've done with other faces besides Margaret Thatcher face. Every once in a while, some clever young student decides to take my face and do the same sort of thing, just to kind of do something for fun. It works with everybody's face. It's much easier to see these distortions when it's upright. And you can do other distortions too. You could take Margaret Thatcher and you could actually elongate her already fairly prominent forehead. You can elongate it. And it would be, and then, have one image with an elongated forehead here and one with a regular forehead. And it would not seem at all distorted when it was inverted. In fact, you might even, at that point, not even be able to tell there were differences in the images at all. But man, once you turn it upright again, it just jumps right out at you. The idea, again, being that this specialized processing we might have for faces is really, really specific to upright faces. Okay. Now, before we leave our discussion of faces, I want to kind of tell you a tiny bit more about where the research stands with regard to whether this is truly specialized processing. And it's discussed in the book to some degree. We'll mention it again. Oh, I think Serena might have mentioned this later on in discussion section. I guess it would have been on Monday. It's now thought that really what's going on here is not something that's necessarily specific to faces, but it is something that works with a set of stimuli, a class of stimuli for which we have expertise. Okay. Now, we all have expertise with faces, right? That's been the kind of discussion as we've been going through this entire chapter, that we're all really good at processing faces subliminally and all that, except, unless we have something like prosopagnosia, where most of us are very good at this. But we're not great with dogs. We're not great with airplanes. We're not great with houses. Unless, for whatever reason, our profession, our hobby has to do with those things. So these sorts of experiments where they would show that inversion works with faces, it doesn't work with dogs, were always done with people who are, maybe dog owners, but aren't dog specialists. What if you bring in a dog specialist? Specifically, somebody who is very good with a specific breed. Okay, maybe your family has bred a type of dog, Cocker Spaniels, German Shepherds, Pit Bulls, something like that. Chihuahuas, any type of dog. Different people specialize in different types of dogs. And when they do that, when they are breeding dogs, it turns out they are able to kind of pick out features of dogs that other people can't. Right? You can imagine this, right? To me, most, German Shepherds, if they all came from the same family, I might have a little trouble distinguishing them at first. But boy, if you breed German Shepherds, you're going to be able to tell the difference pretty quickly. In other words, those people have become experts with that class of stimuli, dog images. And so when you test those people in these sort of inversion experiments and kind of specialty experiments, they will show the same effects that the rest of us show with faces. People that design airplanes will show inversion effects with airplane images as if they're looking at faces. Okay? And there's a lot of other examples of this. In fact, there are examples where people are brought into the lab and taught to learn a class of stimuli that are basically they're images of what looks like kind of trolls or something. I mean, they're kind of like not Lego exactly. I don't know, probably should have brought an image of one of these things, but you know, they're basically kind of high resolution, kind of computer generated images of they look like kind of toys. They're probably about this. If they were real, they'd be about this high, and they have like kind of oval shaped bodies and heads with horns and stuff like that. If people are brought into the laboratory and trained to become specialists in that class of stimuli, they will show the same sort of effects. How do you become a specialist? It's kind of cool. Of course, you're taught to recognize people, but then you're told that these little guys are actually, they grow up in families, and this is so-and-so's brother, and this is so-and-so's father, and this is so-and-so's uncle. And you can see that there's family relations. And this is over the course of a couple of hours. You'll start saying, oh yeah, I can recognize that these people belong together in the same family. And at that point, when they can start to see things like, you know, features and then configurations of the features, allowing them to be members, or I guess typifying them as members of the families, at that point, they start to show inversion effects too. They start to show, you know, kind of like this specialized processing. So it might, all these sorts of things we've been discussing might not be specific to faces. These things might be specific to classes of stimuli for which somebody has expertise. And as we know, that type of expertise is something that can be achieved through experience. You know, we talked about this with regard to wine. We talked about this with regard to sound and stuff. And we can talk about it in vision too. So a dog breeder, okay, someone who's been doing this a long time and is specialized in a class of dogs, Cocker Spaniels, for example, they become visually experts at recognizing different dogs and different families within the, you know, their farm or whatever, that they're able to see the resemblances. And at that point, they become experts, and they might go through the kind of the unconscious processing of you know, that we were talking about before, not an expression, of course, and things like that. But, you know, in maybe it can prime other information about dogs or something like that. In other words, these things that we've been discussing as true for all of us with faces can also be true for people who become experts with a class of stimuli. Okay, so this is true for all of us. It's about faces. It's true for all of us with faces, most all of us, as long as we're intact. But it also might be true of another class of stimuli if one becomes an expert. And they need to become an expert. So think about yourself very, very quickly. What might you be an expert on with a set of, you know, a class of stimuli, something you might, you know, see visually. Maybe cars, if you work on cars, maybe guitars, if you're a guitar collector, something like that. But it has to go just beyond that. You have to kind of see kind of nuances in the relationship between the features across different cars and things like that. That this is more likely to be, you know, part of the Ford family. This is more likely to be part of the you know, Chevrolet family or something like that. When you can do those sort of things, you start to use these specialized sort of processes in your brain for that. True for all of us with faces, true for some of us that have become kind of, you know, specialists in certain types of visual stimuli. Okay, let's continue here. I think rather than taking a break, let's continue and move on to our next topic. So let's switch this. And our next topic is actually going to nicely make use of something we've just discussed, which has to do with imitation. So just getting set up here for our next chapter. Here we go. We've just discussed imitating a little bit when it comes to facial expression. Okay. So it's kind of a nice way of kind of making the transition from faces, because faces, we know, are things that we imitate all the time and often unconsciously. But this idea of unconscious imitation, of inadvertent imitation, also happens in other ways. So you may have noticed yourself talking to somebody at a party, and all of a sudden kind of taking on their posture, their, kind of their nonverbal behavior sometimes is called. If somebody's crossing their arms, you might find yourself crossing your arms. If someone's, kind of rubbing their forehead often, you might find yourself doing that for whatever reason. But more often than not, when this occurs, we are not aware of it. We are not aware of how our postures might imitate other people's postures, how our actions might imitate other people's actions, how our speech even imitates other people's speech. You might not know, for example, speaking of speech, that when you're talking with somebody who talks quickly, like me, I grew up in the Northeast, so I tend to speak more quickly than a lot of people here. In Southern California, you guys are much more laid back. That when you're talking with someone who talks faster, your speech actually speeds up a little bit. And my speech, if I'm talking to somebody who talks a little slower, would slow down a little bit. And again, most often, this is inadvertent. Most often, I am unaware of this happening, just like this facial expression imitation we talked about before. I think we are aware of this sometimes. We are aware of body language, sort of posturing, sort of imitation sometimes. I know I am. Say, oh yeah, I just crossed my arms like they did. Not that often, but the other thing I sometimes am aware of is I'm talking with somebody that has a thick accent for a while. I'll find myself embarrassingly take on that accent a little bit. It's kind of embarrassing to do, but it's something we do every now and then. And these are the times that we are aware of this kind of reflexive imitation we do. But most often, again, it's not something we are aware of doing. And it turns out, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of research on this imitation. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. What this imitation is about, under what situations do we do it, and really, more importantly, how is it related to what we typically do? I mean, does it benefit us in any way? Does it help us kind of socialize better? Does it make things easier in social situations? Does it actually help with our, very fundamental perception? Are we able to see more in what somebody is doing if, in fact, we're doing some subtle imitation of them? Okay? That's what all these things we're going to be discussing over the next hour or so. There's something I should mention about this imitation before we get into it. The imitations we'll be talking about are not the sort of imitations that you used to do to annoy your siblings. Okay, so my boys used to do this when we were in the car, typically, that one of them would start talking and the other one would start, talking exactly like them and repeat everything they say until one of them would get punched or something, right? And I think this is something that a lot of kids do because it's, it is an effective way to annoy a sibling. We are not talking about that type of imitation. We are talking about imitation that is much more subtle and usually a little delayed. So when we, imitate somebody who's crossing their arms, we will not do it right away, and we will not do it in a very kind of conspicuous fashion. Okay, if someone's crossing their arms, maybe after talking to them for a few minutes, we'll cross their arms like this very subtly. And that's the type of imitation we're talking about. We're talking about imitation that is much more subtle than what our siblings did to us, and imitation that is usually delayed a little bit. So we'll get into that later, but I just want to make sure that you understand as we're going through imitation that we're talking about more subtle things than we typically think of when we, consider, impersonators or impressionists like on Saturday Night Live or something like that, or your siblings. Okay. So let me talk about some of the early experiments on this. And a lot of this comes just from, kind of setting up cameras and watching people interact and that sort of thing. And that was the case for one of these early experiments where they set up cameras in a professor's office, and students would come in and interact with the professor during office hours. And what they would find is that, that students would go through a series of actions that did imitate the professors a little bit. So if the professor's talking and he or she crosses their legs, then the student might, after a while, cross their legs too. If the professor is, say, rubbing her forehead like this, then the student might do that later on too. And this is something that could be recorded. After these kind of interactions occurred, they would ask the students, did you have any awareness of doing this as you were interacting with the professor? And they would almost always say no. They would say, no, I didn't know that this was going to be about imitation at all. I was just trying to have the most effective, kind of useful meeting with the professor, and was very unaware of anything else that was going on. But then the other thing they did was, without the professor knowing what this was about, right? They just set up the camera and they say, we're just interested in interactions. They would ask the professor how the rapport was, how the interaction was. Was it more effective or less effective? And what the professors would often say is that the more imitation, the professors would say that the interaction was successful, it was a good rapport, if in fact the student had been doing this imitation. Okay? So again, the professor was not aware of the imitation that was going on, but they were asked, on a scale from 1 to 10, how effective do you think that interaction was? How effective was that office hour meeting? And they would rate that. And what they found was that the ratings that the professors gave the effectiveness of the meetings was related to how much imitation the student was doing of the professor. Okay? And then they would ask the professor after that was over, okay, so thank you for your rating. Did you notice the student imitating you? And they'd say, no, not at all. And they say, well, do you think that your rating of how effective the meeting was might relate to how much they were imitating? And they said, no, I don't want the student imitating me. I mean, they would have no idea. All these things are happening unconsciously, which is so cool. But it did seem to have an influence on how the professors at least rated the rapport. Okay, so that's some of the early research on this. But then experimenters started coming up with kind of more clever ways of testing this out, and by manipulating things, by doing kind of cool kind of tricky experiments. Sneaky, I guess sneaky is the right way to describe these experiments. By the way, what we're talking about here, when this kind of inadvertent imitation happens, has been given the name the chameleon effect. I don't know if you've heard that, but you know what chameleons are, right? They adapt to their surroundings. They change their color depending on the background they're in. The idea is that people will do this too when it comes to certain behaviors, nonverbal behaviors. If I'm with a professor who's rubbing her head a lot, I might start rubbing my head like a chameleon's, kind of blending in with the background of the environment they're in. That's what a chameleon effect is it's related to people. But let me talk about these newer experiments where experimenters coming up with a clever way of testing this. What they would do is they would imagine that you're going to be a subject, and you I don't know if you've been subjects yet, like if you've taken intro psychology, but you can imagine how they are. You go to a laboratory, and typically they'll have you sit outside to wait if you're a little bit early, or if the experiment's running late. So you sit down on a chair that's outside the laboratory, and then somebody else comes in and sits down too, and they say, oh, are you here for the experiment? And you say, yeah, are you here? Yep, I'm in Psych 2, I'm in Psych 1, da-da-da-da-da. You chat a little bit. Okay. Then you both come in, you're both asked to come in, you come in, and you're told to, you're going to be looking at a set of pictures, and that's what you're seeing here with these two people. You're asked to look at a set of pictures and describe them as well as you can, because what you want to be able to do is get the other person to understand what your picture looks like well enough to possibly draw it later or answer questions about it later or something like that. And you'll take turns. They'll do it. They'll look at their picture and describe it as detailed as possible, so you can potentially answer questions about it later. That's a cover story, because what's really going on is that other person who came in with you for the experiment, sneaky. They're actually part of the experiment. They're what you call a confederate. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. Well, you've heard of it, with regards to the Civil War, but this is a different type of confederate. They're a confederate. They're part of the experiment. They're actually probably research assistants in the laboratory you're currently in. They're posing as another subject. Sneaky, huh? Now, here's what they're going to do. As you're interacting, they're going to create a behavior. They're going to perform a behavior that's not very noticeable. It's kind of subtle, but they're interested in when they create that behavior, when they do that behavior, if you then imitate it. So one of it's a foot shake, and I can't do this because you can't see the lower part of my body, but imagine here's my foot. What they might do, you know, sometimes when you're sitting there and you're kind of just antsy, you shake your foot a little bit like this, or maybe like here's the floor, you do this kind of thing a little bit, right? Just a tiny bit. Right? The question is, when they do that, are you more likely to do that as well? So that whole thing with the pictures, cover story, nothing to do with the real experiment. What we're really interested in here is seeing if you, as the real subject, is going to imitate the Confederate as they're doing the foot shaking. The other one was face rubbing, I think they did. They did this sort of thing. So they're looking at the picture saying, yeah, I see there's a car here and it's a stoplight. And it looks like there's some people crossing the street while they're rubbing their face. The Confederate's doing this now. And the question is, are you, as the real naive subject, going to be doing more face rubbing? And so you have a really nice way of doing this here, because now you have somebody in the interaction that's actually creating, manipulating the behaviors that are being evaluated in you as you're being the naive subject going through this. And in fact, it works. It absolutely works. So if the person was doing more foot shaking, you would be more likely to do more foot shaking than if the person was doing nothing at all, or face rubbing for that matter. And if they were face rubbing, you'd be more likely to do some face rubbing than you would foot shaking. So in other words, subjects, and by the way, I should mention that again, this is all unconscious. The subjects were interviewed at the very end of the experiment. The real subjects were interviewed at the very end of the experiment and asked a whole bunch of questions. Did you know that person actually wasn't another subject? It was a pretend subject. They were a Confederate with the experiment. Did you notice that person was shaking their foot? No. Did you notice yourself shaking your foot? No. Did you notice that person was rubbing their face? No. Did you notice yourself rubbing their face? All unconscious. But it happens. They will do the imitation unconsciously. Okay. The imitation, again, just to quickly remind you what we're talking about here, the person starts rubbing their face like this as they're describing their pictures. Okay. The Confederates doing this as they're describing the pictures. The real subject will not do it right away, okay, and will do it subtly. So when it's their turn, for example, to describe their own pictures, they might do something like this, but it will be delayed. It will be after they did that behavior, and it will be subtle. So it's not, again, like the imitation your annoying siblings did with you. Again, though, all unconscious. Subjects never have an awareness of doing this. And if they do, then, you know, their data are removed from the experiment, but it rarely happens that people are aware of this type of thing. The other thing they find is that the speed of the action is also imitated. So if somebody is rubbing their face more quickly, that's something the subject will do. If the Confederates, you know, kind of doing this sort of thing, the real subject will do this inadvertent, this unconscious imitation that is a little bit quicker as well. So the speed of action is also imitated. And this has been now replicated many, many, many times. And again, it's all unconscious. People have no sense of doing this. But all these things can be, you know, manipulated in interesting ways. It works. Some other examples of this, and we'll kind of get then into some of the details of how this all works. If you're watching somebody, say, on a treadmill running, okay, and especially if you just watch them, you know, say you're supposed to count steps or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the cover story is, what the pretend task is. Maybe it's counting steps. And you see them, or how many steps in 30 seconds or something. I don't remember what it was. But you're doing this, and as the person, you're seeing a video of a person on a treadmill, as you're seeing here, counting steps. And they start off slow, maybe they start off walking, and then they start to run, and then they start to run fast. And even though you're counting steps as best you can, and it's tricky, because especially when you get fast, but what's really interesting is what's going on with your breathing. Your own breathing actually starts to imitate or accelerate based on what you, I guess, are assuming the person's breathing is doing as they are going through this treadmill sort of running. So the faster the person runs on the treadmill, your breathing gets elevated. Now, it's not the type of, you're not going to start panting when you see the person running on the treadmill versus walking, but your breathing will be elevated just a little bit, which is interesting. It's like, I think I say in the book, well, if you don't feel like you want to work out, you're feeling lazy, at least go to the gym and watch people work out, because it might increase your metabolism a little bit. Clearly, it's not going to increase it enough to really give you a good workout, but it will start. When you watch somebody exercise, there is this kind of imitative empathy almost in your metabolism, so it does speed up a tiny, tiny bit. Okay, work out for real. Don't just watch people work out, but still, it's interesting that happens. And then finally, I wanted to mention something that's actually, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but my own wife, she's a real psychologist, has a private practice, and she specializes in individuals with eating disorders, and has for 25 years or so. She's seen all types of patients that have had eating disorders, young, old, male, female. And she's very aware of this research. And what that research suggests is that people, whether or not they have an eating disorder, are known to imitate the amount that they will eat depending on how much other people they're sitting with are eating. Okay, so if you're going out to lunch with big eaters that eat a lot of their lunch, that eat, kind of a clean plate club, we used to call it, right? There's a good chance you'll eat more than if you go out to lunch with people who are very light eaters and maybe just pick at their food a little bit. Okay, that's generally something that occurs regardless of our eating, our health, our eating health. But you can imagine with people that have eating disorders, this becomes a serious issue. And especially for folks with serious eating disorders, and they have to be in a clinic, what they have to be very sure of is not to let the serious people that are withholding food eat together during lunch in the in-person clinic, right? Because they're all going to kind of reinforce each other's very, very light eating behavior, and that can be a real problem. So they have to be very careful when it comes to setting up lunch and who gets to sit with who and who is watching who eat and that sort of thing. That's something that they have to be very cautious about, because it happens with all of us. We eat more or less depending on how much other people are eating that we're with. And again, it's all unconscious. It's like, with folks that don't have eating disorders, if you ask them, did you notice that you ate more with this person than you did last week with that person, that sort of thing. And people will say, no, I am completely unaware of my eating behavior changing based on who I'm dining with at any one time. But yeah, it does make a difference. And you can imagine, again, for eating disorder patients, that can be a real issue. Okay. One other thing I do want to say before I leave this slide concerns something kind of interesting, that this imitation that we've been talking about, imitation of faces, expressions, imitation of body language, imitation of breathing and eating, only works when one is either watching or interacting with somebody that's a person. These have to be human actions for us to go through the most imitation. Okay, if you show, for example, a cartoon character, I don't know, SpongeBob running on a treadmill or something like that, your breathing will not increase. If you're watching, a cartoon character smiling versus frowning, you will not have that kind of inadvertent reflexive smile that we talked about before. Okay, it has to be people, and it has to be people that are truly convincing, right? Robots that we don't consider human, we will not do this with. Even things like, the limbs of robots or something like that. So if you see legs that are just legs running on a treadmill and don't know they're connected to a person, you won't induce this breathing. There seems to be something about human actions really, or the brain interpreting actions as human actions before this inadvertent imitation occurs. Okay, it's kind of interesting. It might actually have something to do with the uncanny valley, which we'll talk about in a second. But the imitation will not be induced unless we are convinced it is a human that's doing the behaviors. Okay. All right, good place to take a little break and ask a question, but let's see if you folks have questions. All right, first, all right, Ralph asked a question. You could say this type of reaction of the confederate and the naive subject, it's kind of like an unconscious memory because of a new environment towards the subject, which could cause an unease within the brain that I think causes the brain to follow. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, let me just make sure I've got the whole thing here. That I think causes the brain to follow someone else who is used to the environment as a follow the leader type of thing. Okay, so I think what Ralph is asking is some of the imitation kind of from almost an insecurity of being in a new environment? Are we more likely to imitate if we are in a new environment and are maybe less sure of ourselves, but maybe think the other person is more sure of themselves? That's a great question, Ralph. And I should mention that there's a ton of research on this type of chameleon effect stuff that I couldn't cover it all in the book, but it could in fact be that you do more imitation in a new environment than you do in your own environment or something like that. It could be the case. That's a very good question. What I can tell you that I do know is something that might be a little surprising. I would think that if someone is giving instructions versus taking instructions, the person taking the instructions, the receiver of the instructions, might do more imitating because they're more subservient in that interaction, right? But it actually is the opposite. And this really surprised me when I found this. I don't know if it's in the book, but it's relevant to some of the research we do in my lab, so I know it, that when you're giving instructions, you are more likely to imitate the person who's receiving the instructions. And the idea might be here is that you want to make yourself as understandable to them as possible. And to do that, you might kind of almost want to sound like them, to kind of try to, your unconscious brain wants to, allow them to understand you as best as possible. So maybe your unconscious brain is saying, let's sound like them, so they're used to their own voice. They're used to their own manner of speaking. Let's make these instructions sound as if they're saying them almost, which is kind of cool. It really is, because I always would think that, no, when someone's giving me instructions, they're the dominant person in the interaction, so I'm going to imitate them. I'm going to imitate the dominant person, like the students imitated the professors, all that sort of thing. But no, in this case, it's kind of a little counterintuitive. So it's a great question, and I think that's probably a very complicated answer. Great, thank you for asking, Ralph. Other questions on this type of thing? We're going to be talking more about it, but does anyone have any questions on the chameleon effects and that sort of phenomena? Nope. Okay. Let's do a test question. Let's see. Do we get far enough into? Let me see. Can I ask you this? That's too easy. I don't want to give you that one. We didn't get very far in imitation, so I'm going to ask you faces. Yes, this is facial inversion effects. So we actually did talk about this since the break, today's break. Imagine, facial inversion effects, A, suggest that we use both configural and featural information to perceive faces. B, show that inverting a face makes it disproportionately harder to recognize. C, show that inverting a face makes it disproportionately easier to recognize. Or D, both A and B. Okay, here we go. A few more seconds here. All right. Okay, that's good. Let me show you the results. The correct answer is, in fact, D. Is it the case that all the answers have been both A and B today for every question I asked? Sorry. Maybe it's too easy. All right, anyway. The correct answer is D because A and B are both correct. So facial inversion effects do suggest that we do use both configural and featural information to perceive faces. And the reason of that is because when, remember what configural information is. Configural information is the type of information we're using that is really kind of based on the positions of the features relative to each other. So the eyes are an inch above the mouth or 2 inches above the mouth, which is 1 inch above the chin for Rosenblum. His forehead, the top of his forehead is 3 feet away from his eyes. Just kidding. It's that sort of thing. This is all configural information because we're looking at the configurations relative to each other. If you take Rosenblum's head and put it upside down, okay, you're not going to be able to do that type of analysis, and that's why facial inversion effects happen. You can't use these kind of specialized, kind of extra efficient sort of processes we usually use when we're perceiving faces. So A is correct, and B is correct too. That is really the definition of facial inversion effects, that it shows that inverting a face makes it disproportionately harder to recognize, and that you saw that with Hillary Clinton, of course. C is not correct. Faces are harder to recognize upside down, not easier to recognize upside down. So both A and B were correct, so the correct answer for the entire question is in fact D. Okay, take a picture of it if you haven't. And we can continue. See if there's any other questions. Israel's question. Good. Thank you. All right. Cool. So this next slide is one of my favorite because this kind of, some of this research changed my life. All right, changed my life. It's all relative, right? I know what you're thinking. What a big loser. I know I'm a nerd, but boy, I like this stuff so much. So what this has to do with, well, the first part of this slide has to do with how we imitated it as infants and children and that sort of thing, which we've already talked about to some degree when it comes to faces, right? We talked about the fact that as soon as you're born, you can show facial actions that are like the facial actions you're seeing. Now, they're very subtle sort of actions again. In fact, I have some nice pictures of that here. At 2 weeks old, though, let me show you what happens. Okay. You start seeing protrusions, stuff like this. Now, let me say right off the bat, you probably know, I did not know when before I had kids, but this is not a 2-week-old infant. This infant is probably 6 months old or something like that. And at this point, they can show this type of imitation when somebody poses in front of them. You know, these are much more intentional sort of expressions than a 2-week-old can have. A 2-week-old doesn't have that type of control over their face, really. Their muscular control isn't quite that good. This is more like 6 to 9 months, I would bet. Yeah, something like that. They look more like this. Anyway, what I should say here is the facial actions, they'll show tongue protrusions, blinking, some expression-like behavior. But they look more like this. There you go. I believe that is a 2-week-old infant there, or something close to it. And as you can see there, you know, they're much more subtle. You know, their eyes aren't even really open very much. But that's the sort of behavior you see. So imagine now it's sticking its little tongue out here or something like that. Okay. So this infant will show a little bit more tongue protrusion behavior if somebody in front of them is sticking out their tongue, or somebody in front of them would be sticking out their tongue, or blinking behavior. If somebody in front of them is doing that, they will show a little bit more blinking behavior, some smile-like behavior. And this is in fact, this has been shown for 2 weeks. It's also been shown for kids a little bit younger, as I said, 36 hours perhaps. But you know, this is kind of consistent with that. But again, these are not like these sort of behaviors. So when you have your 2-week-old infant, don't say, oh, Rosenblum said it should be sticking out its tongue like that. No. Like in a 30-second, a 30-second section of time, they're going to, if somebody's sticking out their tongue in front of them, they'll go like this. Something like that, right? It's going to look very subtle. But they also, at this point, can start imitating speech movements, which I think is very interesting. And this is going to be the case if they're hearing speech. So what you're seeing there on the left is how an infant reacts when it's hearing the sound ah, ah, ah. And what you're seeing there on the right is how the infant's going to react if it's hearing the sound mm, mm, mm. Now, they're not able to make much sound now at all, if anything. I don't know if anything's actually, at that age, I don't think they can make audible sound, at least intentional in this way. Certainly they can cry and all that stuff, but I don't think they can actually, get their vocal cords coordinated in some sort of non-reflexive way. But their facial actions seem to imitate the sort of facial actions that are used to produce those sounds, ah and m, right? That's amazing. And again, they're not going to, as soon as they hear ah, they're not going to go spontaneously into that. They're going to show more open mouth ah behaviors in a 30-second span than they will m behaviors if they're hearing ah, then m, and they'll kind of show more m closed mouth behaviors in a 30-second span than open mouth behaviors if they're hearing m versus ah. So they are able to imitate fairly early speech sounds, at least, vowel type sounds like these. And it also works interestingly if they're hearing these sounds, as I said, or seeing these sounds. And what I mean by seeing, which we'll be talking about a lot next class, is if they're seeing somebody's lips do these things and the person isn't making any sound at all. If they're right in their face and they're going like this versus the infant will show those sorts of imitative behaviors as if they're hearing the sounds that that person normally would be making based on the facial configuration. So this imitation of speech, certainly the sounds of speech, are online very early. The infant can, to the degree the infant can coordinate its face at that age, at 2 weeks old, they're showing those sorts of behaviors, which is pretty interesting. As adults, we do a lot more imitation of language. As I mentioned before, we imitate things like the speed with which somebody's talking. And again, subtle, right? So you and I get together and say you're from laid back Laguna, dude, right? Everything's copacetic, okay? That's not the way people from Laguna talk necessarily, but they're more laid back. They're more like, kind of go with the flow sort of thing. And I talk fast. I'm a neurotic Jewish person from upstate New York, right? What happens when we meet each other is I start slowing down a little bit and you start speeding up a little bit, that type of thing. We're not going to completely match, but we're going to kind of head towards each other. But we also imitate other aspects of each other's speech when we're talking. We kind of borrow each other's words to some degree. And every once in a while I'm aware of this. There's lots of different ways to say different ideas, happy, cheerful, joyful, all that sort of stuff. Depending on what words you just use to express that feeling, I would be more likely to use that word too, right? So I would borrow the word. And I wouldn't necessarily do it right away, but I would be more likely to do it in our conversation later on. Syntax, the word ordering that we use, that's what syntax means here. So, there's different ways of conveying the same idea. The dog bit the cat, right? You can say it that way versus saying it, the cat was bit by the dog, right? Both of those convey the exact same idea. It's just that, one has a ordering of the words that we sometimes call active voice. It doesn't make too much of a difference of its technical name, but the dog bit the cat is one way of saying it, and then the cat was bit by the dog is the other way. And the way the syntax, what distinguishes those two sentences is the syntax, it's the ordering of the words. And we borrow each other's syntax. So if you're likely to do it in what we say is the passive voice, the cat was bit by the dog, I'm more likely to use that too and later on say, oh, the ball was hit by the bat or something like that. Okay, so we borrow that from each other. We imitate that from each other when we're communicating. The rate I've already mentioned, right? Fast talking neurotic Rosenblum gets together with you, who is laid back Laguna surfing person. We imitate each other's rate to some degree. We'll kind of make compromises, again, all at an unconscious level. The intonation. So what intonation is like kind of the melody of the speech. And maybe, people who kind of have a, kind of very wide range of speech when they talk. Who we used to talk about. I don't know if you know who Jay Leno is. He still has a show on TV, but he used to be on late night before Jimmy Fallon was on. And he used to have this thing where he talked really high and then he talked really low like that. It was just his style. And that's kind of this very dramatic sort of intonation. Most people don't have anything that extreme, but, depending on how animated somebody is, maybe they'll go, high and low more often versus somebody who maybe is a little bit more reserved and talks more in a monotone like this, right? We'll do more. We'll kind of imitate each other's intonation. If I'm talking with somebody who's a little bit more monotone, I might become a little more monotone, and they might become a little bit more, kind of expansive on their intonation. And then finally, accent. Right? We talked about this already. And even if we're not imitating somebody's accent in that kind of embarrassing situation where we're aware of it, we are always imitating little pieces of a person's accent, even if they don't have a thick accent. I'm not sure my accent's that different from most people in Southern California that are native English speakers, because I grew up in upstate New York. But certainly my parents grew up in New York City, New York, and they kind of had subtle accents. And certainly I would find myself imitating them every once in a while, even if it's a more subtle thing. But even when you're not aware of it, it's happening. It's happening a lot. And it's happening, this is where I thought it was really interesting. This is the sort of thing that kind of changed my research life to some degree. A situation in which we're talking not just about things that you might possibly notice in accent, but the fine-grained aspects of speech, the parts of speech that distinguish the ways we talk that are so small that you really need something like a computer to typically be aware of it. And that's what research shows. So let me give you this really cool example. Think about the way you produce these two different consonants, P and B, and let's put them in a syllable, pa versus ba. And in fact, you can get insight into how your vocal cords are producing pa versus ba by putting your hand in front of your face like this. When you say pa, there's a little puff of air. Pa versus ba. And there's not much puff there for ba. Ba, pa. Why do you get a puff of air there? Well, you get a puff of air there because your vocal cords, okay, are actually apart when you produce the p sound for pa. And the air rushes between your vocal cords and out your lips. Pa. When I release my lips, my vocal cords are apart. They're not catching the air. And so air rushes through my vocal cords, rushes through my lips, and that's why I get that puff for pa. When I make a ba sound, something different is happening. When I make a ba sound, okay, my vocal cords, when I release my lips, my vocal cords are already vibrating. They've caught the air. Ba. You can feel down here. Ba. They've caught the air before my lips are releasing. So you don't have that air rushing through like that. The vocal cords kind of have caught a lot of the air. And so, ba, okay, you don't get that puff, all right? So here what we're talking about. Well, before we do that, one more thing I want you to do. So another way of just determining this is you can touch your lips like you're doing Tadoma. Touch your lips with one hand, touch your vocal cords with the other. And when you do pa, feel what happens here. Pa. So do it really slow. Pa. You feel your lips release before your vocal cords start vibrating. When you do ba, something else happens. Ba. You can feel your vibrations before, very, very shortly before your lips release. Ba. So the timing between your vocal cords vibrating and your lips releasing is different for pa versus ba. I'm exaggerating them here just so you can understand it. And you can feel it easier that way if you exaggerate it. Again, the timing relationship about when your lips release and when your vocal folds or your voice starts down here is different from pa versus ba. This is called, so pa versus va, this is called voice onset time. And don't worry too much about, I mean, you should know what it is, but you don't have to worry about the technical details. Just know that the relationship of when the vocal cords or voice starts relative to when the lips release, the lips part, is different for pa versus ba. I just got a graph here to show you. Here, okay. This is lips, and this is the lips closed, and this is lips released. That's very easy. And here is what happens with your vocal cords. And when it's a straight line, they're not vibrating, they're apart. But when it's wiggly like this, that means your vocal cords are vibrating. They've caught that air and they're vibrating. Look what happens. Let's first look at the bottom here. For ba, look what happens. The vocal cord, voicing just means vocal cord vibration here. The vocal cords start vibrating and then the lips release. Ba, and then your lips release. For pa, look at it as it's different. In this case, the lips release first just before the vocal cords start vibrating. See this? Vocal cords start vibrating before the lips release for ba. Vocal cords start vibrating. The voicing happens just after the lips release for pa. And then if you're going to exaggerate pa, like pa, you can see here, that's what I was trying to have you do before to really have a sense of what I'm talking about. If you really exaggerate it, pa, you get a long delay after you release the lips and the voicing starts happening. The vocal cords start vibrating. You got that? Hopefully you do. Just know that in this graph, I realize I'm talking about voicing. And voicing is just when the vocal cords start vibrating. So the voice onset time, the time the voice begins, is before the release of the lips for ba and after the release of the lips for pa. The voice onset time is different for those two syllables. Okay, cool. Hey, you learned a lot about speech in just 5 minutes. All right. Here's the thing about imitation. Different people have different amounts of delay for their pas. Okay? Different people have different amount of delays for their pas. And it depends on where you're from. It depends on your native language. It depends if you're royalty. So if I'm royalty in England, I might say, David Beckham and Posh Spice are coming over tonight. And listen to what I just did when I said Posh Spice. I had a long delay here. Okay? And that's how, the Queen might say it. Sir Beckham, no, not Sir yet. Okay, someday probably. Mr. Beckham and his wife Posh are coming tonight. Let's make sure we do a good showing. And by saying Posh this way, I'm having a long delay here before my vocal cords start vibrating, before my voicing starts. Versus, when Beckham and Posh come to visit me, which is frequently, they're good friends of ours. No, I'm kidding. I say, hey, let's bring in some good Mexican food tonight because Posh and Beckham are coming over tonight, or let's barbecue for Posh and Beckham. I don't have that sort of delay for Posh. So there's a very, very conspicuous difference between how the Queen says Posh and I say Posh. But even discounting those extreme differences between me and the Queen of England, okay, the way you and I say Posh might be different. There can be subtle differences in that. And in fact, there are. We all have a little bit of a different delay in how we make our Ps. This extent is going to be different for different people. Here's the thing. Oh, by the way, I'll tell you how little this is. It can be as little as 1/20th to 2/20th of a second. That's how different Mine can be from yours. So I grew up in upstate New York, so probably the way I say posh is similar to the way my high school friends say posh, maybe. And we're different, though, by just maybe 1/20th of a second. Here's the thing. When I get together with my friends, we even imitate each other's delays at that fine-grained level, okay? So that we imitate these extents so that I'm changing my voice onset time for my pa articulations by as little as 1/200th of a second. Tell me that isn't cool. In other words, I am controlling, my brain is controlling my speech articulation so that it imitates somebody else's speech articulation at such a fine-grained level. There's no way I could do this consciously. There's no way I could do this willfully. Like I want to now intend to change my vocal cords so they start vibrating 1/200th of a second sooner because I'm with my friends from high school now. Okay? No, this happens automatically. So the brain is doing this imitation at such a fine-grained level, it goes beyond what we could intend to do, which is just amazing. This is kind of the finding that kind of got me into all this. I thought, oh my gosh, this is really, really, really cool. So wait, do we? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so I thought you'd find that interesting. All right, let me continue with this discussion now. Thought we should take a break. No, let's wait to take a break. Let's continue this discussion. If you had any questions of that, feel free to type them out, and I'll answer them when we take our next break. But let's continue to talk about this. So, all right, now hopefully you're convinced this is something that we do. We do all the time, this imitation. We do it, again, I need to emphasize, we do it in a delayed manner. We do it much more subtly than how we willfully try to imitate our siblings to bug them. But it's something that happens automatically. It's something that happens unconsciously. Certainly what we're talking about here with speech happens unconsciously. We don't even have that type of control, our willful control over, our intentional control over our articulatory tract. This is something that happens reflexively at a very fine-grained level. Why? Why does this happen? So it's cool that it happens, but why does it happen? There could be a lot of explanations for it. But I think you'll find some of what happens when it happens interesting that might help explain this. In other words, is there some result of us imitating? And there is. Imitation seems to make you a better person. What do I mean by that? It facilitates social interactions. You already got a hint of that. Remember, we talked about this when I first introduced, some of these chameleon effects with the professors and the students, where the students were imitating the professors, and the professors would then rate that interaction as having better rapport, more positively. Again, not knowing it was based on the imitation, but still they would say that was a more positive interaction. Does that happen in other ways? Are there other ways to actually measure this? And what I'd like to do is bring you back to our laboratory. And now, okay, this is clever. It's by the same lab, you can imagine. You're going to be sitting outside for an experiment again in a chair. And now what's going to happen is you're going to, as before, someone's going to come in and say, oh, there's another chair. They sit down. Which class are you in? I'm in Psych 1. I'm in Psych 2. Cool. Isn't that cool? Hopefully this will be over in not too long. I got a lot to do today. Da, da, da. And you go in, and you're absolutely expecting it to be another subject. And you're doing the exact same task as you did before. Okay, before I describe what that says there, let me talk about the task, remind you of it, and talk about what's happening. So you're asked to look at pictures, and you're asked to describe it as most accurately as you can, so they can have enough detail to potentially draw that picture later on, answer questions of that picture later on. Okay, and you take turns. You do one, they do one, you do one, they do one, just like that. Okay. Now, you and I know that other subject is actually a Confederate, right? It's a Confederate like in the experiment before. I don't, the subject doesn't know that, but We've talked about this before. They're going to do something different, though. Before we when we were discussing this, we talked about them being the one that actually produced the behavior. They're going to take the other side of this now. What they're going to do is imitate your behavior. Okay? So I'm talking about this picture, and look at what he's doing there. It looks like he's doing this type of thing. Okay, so I see a car at an intersection. I see people walking across the intersection. Okay, you're done. Your turn. Confederate's turn. The Confederate takes this, say, okay, I see a church with people outside, and it looks like they're dressed up maybe. It looks like there's a wedding cake there. Okay. As the Confederate, what I just did is I imitated the real subject. I did it delayed, right? There was a delay between the switching of the pictures. And I'm going to do it a little bit more subtly. Okay. All right. After that interaction is over, okay, the real subject is asked questions about the interaction. They're asked whether they liked the person, whether they thought the interaction was successful, how well do you think that you would do if the task really did involve now having to draw the pictures or answer questions about that picture. And for subjects who had been imitated in that delayed, subtle manner, they thought the interaction went better, it went more smoothly, it was going to be more successful, and they liked the person better. Okay. So being imitated makes you like a person more, and it makes you consider the interaction as more successful, as it says there on the slide. Okay, very cool. What else does it do? Okay. Oh, by the way, I need to just remind you, subjects at the end of these experiments are completely interviewed. They're asked if they knew that they were imitated. 99% of the subjects say, I had no idea. I don't think I thought, I would have noticed if they imitated me. I hate being imitated, but of course it's being done in a very subtle, slow way. If subjects are aware of it, very few are. They are, their data isn't used. That sort of thing, but most people absolutely have no idea this works. We're talking about this all occurring on an unconscious level. What else happens? When a person is being imitated, like this, in this type of experiment, they are more likely to agree on something, and whether it was agree on some sort of task, maybe some sort of social issue that's not too emotionally charged. They'll be more likely to agree if they're being imitated on. If you're at a table and being served by a waitress who goes through some imitative sorts of behaviors, the chances are you'll tip them more than if they didn't go through the imitative behavior. There's some evidence that if you are, in one of these, tests you sometimes see on the street or in a mall, where you're asked to, try a new product, grocery store, asked to try a new product, your response of how much you like that product would be subtly changed depending on if the person was imitating you. So, Costco, of course. You're in Costco. I don't know if they're doing samples anymore. Probably not right now. But, in the old days, they would do samples, and you take the sample of this Powerade, right? And you'd sip, and the person would kind of subtly imitate your own behaviors, maybe get your body language a little bit, maybe use a little of your intonation. You'd be more likely to say you like the Powerade than if you weren't being imitated. Now, this is something, if you've ever taken a marketing class or a sales class or something like this, you may have heard this sort of thing before. It can work a little bit. Sometimes people are trained to do this. People in sales will say that they know if you do a little imitation of the person, use their words, that sort of thing, you might be more likely to make the sale. It's unclear how, it certainly can't get people to do things they absolutely don't want to do. Like if you hate Powerade, if it's a terrible Powerade, you're not going to pretend you like it because the person's imitating you. It's nothing like that. But little subtle shifts here and there can be induced by this, again, unconscious, inadvertent sort of imitative behavior that occurs. And then this avatar-like ability. I just want to say something very quickly about that. Don't worry too much about it. You won't get a question. I don't think you get a question on avatars, but these are just, besides the movie Avatar, these are computer-generated images or voices that are sometimes used when you're on the phone. Eventually the idea would be, rather than interacting with the computer voice that responds when you're calling the airlines or on hold for an insurance company or something like that, you would see somebody actually, like a animated character, an avatar animated character, and research suggests that if you can get that avatar to kind of do some of the imitative behaviors of you as you're interacting with them, people do find it a little bit more effective, the conversation. If you can get the robot voice, the synthetic voice, during your on hold calls, to imitate your voice a little better, people will say it's a more positive interaction. I just wanted to kind of give you some of the potentially practical sorts of uses for our understanding of this kind of imitative behavior we're discussing. Again, as we've been saying over and over again, this imitation needs to be subtle, it needs to look natural or smooth, and it needs to be delayed a little bit. It can't be the sort of, as I've been saying, it can't be the sort of imitation that we do with our siblings, or the sort of kind of, the kind of funny imitation they do. What's his name? Baldwin does of Trump, that sort of thing on Saturday Night Live. It has to be a very subtle, smooth, and delayed sort of imitation, so it doesn't attract attention to itself, that sort of thing. Finally, it seems that this is the better person aspect of this. So, being imitated will make you like a person better a little bit and all that. But it actually, your positive feelings actually generalizes past the actual person that you are interacting with potentially. And I'll talk about a couple of experiments. One is where you're in this experiment that we've been discussing, where the Confederate now is imitating you, okay? And that's going to make you like them a little bit better and consider the interaction more positive. But then it's over, and you're told, okay, we're going to leave you in here, real subject, and then they take the other subject, fake subject, out and put them in another room. Say, just wait here. We're gonna bring you your credit slip so you can have a receipt saying that you were part of the experiment. And then somebody new comes in, holding a big stack of papers and a kind of pile of pencils on top of the papers. And they walk towards you. As they're walking towards where you're sitting on your seat there, they trip and kind of fall, and the pencils go everywhere. The pencils will go all over the floor. And the person's not hurt, they kind of collect themselves and they still have the papers, but they go, oh my gosh. And they put the papers down somewhere and they start to pick up the pencils. You help them because you're a good person. I'm sure you all would help the person. But the number of pencils and how quickly you kind of bend down to pick up the pencils will depend on if you were imitated in the previous interaction. If you were imitated, as we talked about the Confederate doing before, you will be, willing to bend down faster and pick up more pencils than if you weren't imitated. So you're kind of the positive ramifications of that interaction not only are directed towards the person who is imitating you, you like that person a little better, but can then get kind of directed to somebody new, which is kind of cool, right? It's kind of this altruistic kind of effect on helping other people. And there's another example of this I discuss in the book, where same type of thing, you're interacting with a Confederate. You don't know they're a Confederate, but they're imitating you. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to have you go out to another part of the lab, and you're going to sit in a chair at a table, and you say, okay, wait here. We're going to bring you your $5. then you can leave. You're one of those paid experiments instead. And you're waiting there, and you notice there's a little kind of bottle there that has a sign on it, and and there's money inside. There's singles inside. It says on the bottle, consider contributing some of your payment to the homeless or to starving children or something like that. Okay, and they look at it and say, oh, okay. And then they come in with a payment. It's in singles, right? You get $5 in singles, and the question is whether or not you'd contribute something. You would be more likely to contribute something if, in fact, you had been imitated in that interaction before with the Confederate. If you hadn't been imitated, you might contribute a little bit, but less than if you had been imitated. Maybe you'll put $1 in instead of $2 or $3, that sort of thing. So being imitated, I mean, I think a lot of us think about imitation as kind of being a negative thing. When someone imitates you, it's a negative thing. Here's this imitation, again, delayed, slow, all that stuff, subtle, that actually facilitates your, kind of altruistic feelings, your positive feeling towards other people. By the way, this is, just so you get this in your notes, we sometimes call this the pencil dropping experiment or something like that. We actually tried this in my lab just kind of for fun. So it's a long story what we were after here, but it took a lot of practice for our research assistants to learn to drop pencils in a kind of natural way. There's a bit of acting that has to go on. Not everyone's a good actor when it comes to it, but it did work. If the person was imitated, they did help more, as it turns out. And we had to figure out a good way of counting the pencils. But yeah, it was kind of a fun experiment to try out ourselves. Okay, cool. Let me see what we're doing here with time. Yeah, this is not a bad place to take our break. Might end a little bit early today. I'm really hesitant to do that. But let's see if there's any questions first. Are there any questions now? Okay. Then let's just do one more test question for fun. They are fun, aren't they? All right. Yeah, it's too easy. Let me find another one. Yeah, good one. Okay. This one is about how infants imitate speech. Remember? We saw that in 2 slides ago, I guess. And here it is. Very young infants have been shown to imitate ah and m mouth movements when A, you'll know why I'm laughing in a second, when hearing these speech sounds, B, when seeing these speech movements, C, reading these letters, okay, like reading text letters, or D, both A and B. Oh my gosh, I don't know how it worked out like this. We're going to do so well on this exam. It's going to make me cry. Don't make me very happy. All right. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds here. Cool. All right, well, you got this one too, pretty much. The answer is, of course, D, very quickly. Yes, they do these sort of things when they hear speech, but they also can do it when they see the mouth positions or the mouth movements as well. So if somebody comes right up in their face and goes, or like that, they will imitate those sort of movements as well. So whether they are hearing the speech or seeing, kind of lip reading the speech on the person's face, they will do more imitation. Again, the imitation is kind of sporadic, but it is measurable, and it suggests that infants are able to kind of do this imitative response very early on, which is interesting. Okay, any questions on any of this? Should be pretty straightforward. Take your picture if you haven't. And we'll end here and then talk more about this on Thursday. All right, see you on Thursday.